Hey guys, Palsteron here, and today let's talk about buff and nerf predictions for the upcoming patch 3.23. Now, I want to preface this by saying I have no idea what's going to happen. All I can throw out is a Hail Mary attempt, basically, at kind of summarizing what I think could be wrong with the game. I usually lean on the side of buffs rather than nerfs, but what I will talk about is the kind of nerfs that I think they would make to kind of stabilize the meta. However, if those nerfs come with no buffs, that could be quite a problem as well. So we'll have to see. Also, we're going to be reacting to the patch notes live over on twitch.tv/Palsteron. I'll be online like 2 hours before. We're going to do a little bit of bingo. But yeah, let's get into the video with, first up, a positive note, the buffs. Now, buffs are almost impossible to predict, and that's mostly because sometimes they take random skills and just tune them a little bit. They used to do this way more, but nowadays what they like to do is full reworks. And they very often don't land. For example, the self-cast rework that they tried recently, or the first bow patch that we had that basically knocked down point blank, knocked down tornado shot a peg, which didn't really help back then. They had to rebuff it later. But in general, I think they are now going to tackle melee. Or at least I hope they do, because aside from Bone Shatter, you cannot really find too many skills here that get play. And sure, you could argue some of them are fine, right? Like, for example, Lightning Strike or Molten Strike, but those are very often projectile based. And they often revolve around very similar things to stuff like bow or stuff like returning projectiles that have basically nothing to do with melee. There's a lot of very interesting skills that I would like to try out that right now just aren't really on par, and we're gonna quickly talk about why that is. So if I see a melee rework, the first thing I would do is determine all skills that aren't slams and remove this right here. This is the death of a lot of these strike skills in general. Strike skills are already clunky. You have to make them work with melee splash with extra strikes, and they still aren't the greatest clear. Back when they nerfed slams and reworked melee, one thing they did is slap less attack speed multipliers on a lot of skills. Like, these did not exist before that patch, which I don't remember when it was it like 3.13 or something? Maybe it was 3.15, but that was a death nail in melee sights. Now, for slam skills, on the other hand, I think this makes sense thematically, right? You want to do big bonk, but the payoff has to be there as well. So definitely remove all these pesky less attack speed multipliers from everything that has nothing to do with Warcries. And then buff either Warcries directly or slam skills, which I'm not really sure about. They'll probably know better. Now, there's a few other things to tackle here, though, and the first one would be dual wield needs a big buff. So one of the things that shields got is, over the years, they got a lot really good unique shields, but on top of that, spell suppression got into the game, and the shield slot, especially after they nerfed spell suppression on some parts of the gear, the shield slot was a lot more important. But in general, dual wield just isn't really interesting. It has a lot of problems. So I was kind of laughing earlier about this claw mastery, which is, I mean, it's just kind of like funny to me that they made this. They obviously know that it is a problem, but how it used to be is you could basically make it so your offhand is just a stat stick. So your main hand, which is a really expensive and good weapon, you could just have there, and it would never like alternate. Your offhand would just be global buffs, which would basically let you use the same weapon that you have in your main hand in your offhand with just like a tick box. Very often a problem with dual wield is not just that it's weaker or something, it can also be that it's quite hard to acquire the same weapon again in your offhand as well. But it would be kind of weird and antithetical to the game, so I don't think that's going to happen. So besides giving us stat sticks again, which is kind of a clusterfuck, it would just have to be increased the dual wield bonus or something like that. But yeah, I don't see dual wield coming back anytime soon. A big problem that is not just something for melee, but also for other attack skills is that you don't really have a lot of base damage. So when I tried a few projectile attack skills on Guardian, I was kind of blown away by just how much damage you get from Anger and Wrath very, very early, because having to itemize into flat damage, like be it elemental or physical, is quite hard. And if you gave skills a little bit more intrinsic damage, then they would be a little bit more similar to spells, and spells are very strong by leveling because you get that base damage per level, and that doesn't really happen right now. One of the problems is, though, that, for example, if you give a skill a lot of flat fizz, now you're kind of forced to go fizz or conversion or something like that, instead of being able to maybe just go random flat LE damage from auras. Now, Last Epoch actually has a very smart way to handle that with adaptive damage, which basically just means that if the most damage you deal is physical, the flat damage on your weapon is going to be physical, or lightning or something like that, but that might clash with the theme of some of the skills, so I'm not really sure about that. Now with Bone Shatter, I think it will get adjusted. If they rework melee and buff it in general, they cannot leave it the way it is right now. But I think that if they rework the skills in general, Bone Shatter will be as good as it is right now, maybe a little bit worse. I just think that they will try and get some of these other skills a little bit more in the limelight. Next up, let's talk about Ascendancy Reworks that are hopefully buffs, but obviously you never know. They have reworked quite a bit of Ascendancies over the years. Usually they just take 2 or 3 at a time. Recently they have been doing complete reworks of Ascendancies, so completely strip it from the get-go and not just rework certain points. So I can't really talk about what that will be, but Glad definitely needs a rework. We're going to talk about Bleed in a second, but I think that if Bleed gets buffed, you can actually keep the Bleed nodes as is. They are very strong. Maybe give them a tiny bit of a buff. So I really don't think these nodes are the problem. It's mostly the block theme. And that has a lot to do with how block lines up against a lot of the evasion rework, and now spell suppression lining up against spell block, where spell block is a little bit more unreliable and takes way more points to spec into, and obviously also that they completely changed this node right here. So yeah, it's impossible for me to know, but from how many people are playing Guardian, it's just kind of needed. Assassin doesn't need as much help, but it does need some polish, because first up, this node is completely outdated. After they removed the interaction with Withering Step, this node is just kind of worthless. And it's not just that, it is also the fact that poison builds now just straight up get crit immunity from the mastery as well. So from a crit mastery ascendancy, giving no extra damage from crit strikes is a little bit of a weird choice. And I know you used to get it anyways from the claw nodes if you wanted to. It was on the claw nodes before, but still that at least was a little bit of an investment that you didn't have to do anymore if you were assassin. But now it's just, I mean, it's just free. I think that these crit nodes are actually mostly fine. They do what you want them to do. If you look at Ice Trap, for example, they want damage and they get damage. I think Opportunistic is fine. They're very themed. I think Ambush and Assassinate is pretty underrated in general. I think if one node needed a buff, it would be Unstable Infusion. A lot of Power Charge stackers and even builds that just have like 6, 7 are already using Power Charge on crit support because it's just the best support for them still. So they already get this effect. They already get Power Charges for free. So on top of the +1, maybe give something else. And when it comes to the poison nodes, I think Noxious Strikes is actually one of the strongest ascendancy points in general. After they nerfed so many sources of poison duration, getting straight up 100% poison duration, some recovery, and then on top, global chance to poison is just amazing. Global chance to poison also affects your explodes, so that's pretty big for Azanovs on top of everything else, and obviously for spellcasters. Now, when it comes to toxic delivery, the problem is not just toxic delivery. The problem goes way deeper with Perfect Agony, because this keystone just kind of sucks. So if they want to make Assassin good, they don't just have to buff toxic delivery. They could maybe even stay the same, but they would first have to buff Perfect Agony. The problem with this keystone is that the dot multi that you get from your crit multi is in the same pool as the dot multi you already get. And getting dot multi is not as hard as it used to be. And then on top of that, what they have to buff is this support gem here, which might be one of the worst support gems tied with Chance to Fear, and make it into an actual more multiplier or something. I don't know, like maybe 55% more or 50% more poison damage from crits or something like that. They could easily do that. And yeah, then maybe crit poison could kind of compare to what Pathfinder is doing. And like I said, if those are fixed, I think toxic delivery might not even need a buff. And yeah, poison crit could maybe be a little bit more competitive. When it comes to Berserker, that is the last one I have on my list. I'm not really sure. I mean, you could completely rework it, maybe just change Defy Pain, but I think I like Berserker where it is. It kind of fits the theme. You don't have a defensive node. I just want to say I would love if Indomitable Resolve would actually be a node here, so you can kind of have the contrast between Aspect of Carnage next to Indomitable Resolve. So that would be cool. So maybe replace that with Define Pain and come up with something new. But in general, I think if melee gets fixed, I think Berserker will be fine. I guess one more thing, if Kaom Spirit actually gets nerfed, which we're going to talk about a little bit later, that would also give a lot of extra power to Berserker on its own, because these gloves kind of invalidate a lot of the identity that Berserker has right now. And sure, you could argue Rite of Ruin is still there and triples your effect, but that is a total of 4 points, and Crave the Slaughter then doesn't do much. Now, number 3, let's talk about Bleed buffs. So Bleed needs some help, and it's, I think, a lot more simple than, for example, melee. It just needs more damage. And I don't just mean intrinsically, I also mean maybe a little bit more support on the passive tree. Bleed builds are very reliant on, for example, Cluster Jewels. Maybe that's fine for them. In general, you just need to deal more damage right now. It is kinda rough. Maybe a rework what Crimson Dance does. Also, just giving more options like Ensnaring Arrow so enemies are actually moving. would be a big deal as well. And talking about bow blade, you got to be a little bit careful of a snipe support right now, or I guess it's not really support, it's just snipe. Can be a support, which has a lot of damage multipliers here. It is quite a clunky playstyle if you want to use it for snipe, but in general, the damage could get a little bit out of hand if you buff bleed too much. But I think it's kind of stupid that the archetype relies so much on snipe. Number 4, and this is something I actually don't think will happen. I just put it in here because I want it so badly, which is wand buffs. The reason I don't think it will happen is something like bows is just such a massive archetype with so many skills, whereas wands is just kind of niche. But since they're both ranged attack builds, the comparison obviously I think is fair. So let's see at bows versus wands. Bows get double the base damage from their weapon, and you might say, well, wands get shield, but bows also get a quiver. So sure, one is defensive, one is offensive, but you could say that's kind of like a trade-off. Sure, so that is kind of crazy. The second one is bows get a second 6-link for single target, which, especially when you factor in that they wanted to fix a lot of the problems with wanders and bow builds with barrage support, is kind of odd. Forcing wanders into either a 4-link clear or a 4-link single target is super odd in my opinion. And then we have bows getting mana forged arrows, although I have a feeling that will get addressed soon. Either way, Spellslinger is an absolute mess right now. Also, bows get Mirage Archer, which isn't as big as it used to be, but still worth mentioning. Now, wands just need more damage, but the problem is if you give them intrinsic damage, if you, for example, increase their damage effectiveness, which, to be honest, they have very low damage effectiveness in general. They just do. They have no overlapping capabilities other than maybe Barrage. They did fix Kinetic Bolt back in the day. When it got released, it was completely broken. And after like a patch or two, it got demolished. So it never hits more than once. The base damage is incredibly low. But if you just blanket buff wand builds, Kinetic Blast is being played in endgame. And that's because it is the arguably best clear skill in the game. And if you put enough currency into it, every skill works, as we know. So for example, on Strength Stackers right now, Kinetic Blast can actually still do damage with insane investment. So if you buff that up, I don't know if that's a good idea for endgame builds. I just know that if you've ever tried leveling a Wander build, it's pretty rough. And before 20 to 50 divines, you're not really making anything interesting. Number 5, and I don't think this will come immediately, but I think it will come in the future. This is a lesson they should learn from what Tattoos did. My lesson from Tattoos wasn't necessarily, I need Tattoos in the game. They're cool and all, but there was 2 lessons. One, that attributes kind of suck if you don't stack them, but that's for another day. But the quality of life we got from, for example, melee strike range and projectile speed is dearly missed on the passive tree right now. The only reason bow builds take projectile speed right now at all is because there's a bow mastery that also gives you damage. And sure, you could argue a lot of people are just not going to take nodes that don't increase their PoE DPS or whatever. But that's just maybe because the payoff isn't there. Like, maybe the power of 3 points is just not there. Like, for example, if there was 3 points here that gave you a total of 70% increased projectile speed, even if the bow mastery didn't exist, that would be something interesting for a lot of min-max builds. Projectile speed is also dearly needed for builds that aren't hit-based, because if you look at the sources of projectile speed right now, they're all connected. For some reason, they're all connected to projectile damage, which, for example, doesn't work for poison or bleed or whatever. So you have these quality of life stats tied to hit-based builds, and basically all of them. The only thing you can do is maybe take one of these projectile masteries, but even then you would have to take a projectile cluster, which, once again, most of them don't really work for poison, for example. This one is the same thing. So yeah, that's kind of awkward as well. I think even more important than that, though, is the missing melee strike range from the tree. If we look at it right now, strike range, everybody gets Master of the Arena if you're in this region right here. A few masteries have +3. You maybe get +2 there. All I can tell you is that these nodes are ridiculously bad. All I can tell you was that playing melee builds last league with like +20 melee strike range or something, or I guess +2 meters now, from strength nodes on Tattoos was godlike. It was very fun to play with, or at least a lot more fun than it used to be. So I would really like them to maybe include something like that. And then talking about AoE, currently we have 2 AoE clusters right up by which are just global, which is cool. And you have Brinkmanship down here, but I don't really see much other support. There used to be a projectile speed AoE thingy here. I think it was like a 2-pointer, which I felt was really well placed, but they kind of just made away with that. Yeah, and now there's no AoE here whatsoever for anybody. Maybe that's thematic for them. I think it's a little bit weird. And the last one here, which is going to happen eventually if they want spell totems back in the meta. buff the support gem. Honestly, spell totems are pretty close. Right now, the problem is if you, for example, go Freezing, Pulse, Ice Spear, Totem, you know this. You can go high damage, but your defenses absolutely suck. Like, your actual paper. And if you want to build defenses, you do no damage. And if you look at the spell totem support, you kind of realize why. You're kind of forced into either a Soul Mantle support, which got nerfed. The +1 totem got removed. So now if you want to be not squishy, you probably need a different body armor. And spell totem on its own has 40% less damage and 40% cast speed. That is 2 separate less multipliers. And if you look at that, you can see that one totem of a certain spell does 36% of the damage of the normal spell. So what that would mean is that you're missing one support gem as well, though. So let's say that would be like 30% more damage or something. You would be looking at 27% of the damage of the normal skill per totem. So now, how many totems are you going to get? Well, you're going to get +1 from the passive tree, +1 from a shield, which still doesn't bring this up very much, only up to like 80. And then you have to go Hierophant for spell totem. And then you're barely getting over the damage you would have if you self-casted it. And sure, you have the playstyle, but at the same time, you also have the downside of your totems being able to die. You also have the downside of not having any Leech and not dealing any damage yourself. So it's just kind of awkward. The payoff is really not there anymore. I think if they literally just buff this support gem, for example, to 30-30, that would solve everything. If you change it to 30-30, I think that's right up around about 40% more damage than it is right now. That would solve it. They already addressed a lot of the issues right here. Totems only used to have 3 ascendancies. You go Ritual of Awakening, you go Conviction of Power, and then you have nothing left if you don't go Mana Stacker, right? But now you have Arcane Blessing, which also gives you 20% more damage. So that would probably just fix it. Now, there's a lot of other things to talk about, but I've talked already so much. And for everybody who knows GG, we know there's some nerfs coming. Now, I don't condone most of these nerfs. Some of them I think are necessary, but in general, I obviously like to just play more archetypes and have more options. So yeah, that's just that. But we have to talk about bow builds first. I think most people like bow builds. Bow builds are really fun to play. They're fast to play if you're a Deadeye. They're just fun. Moving is more fun than shield charging around as well, and you're kind of forced into that. Yada, yada, yada. But bow builds, ever since they got double flat damage, if you guys remember, bows got a little bit of a two-hander update, which is kind of a big deal that some of us didn't realize back then, but it was what kind of started this whole rampage into bow builds being what they are today. And I want to be careful with this because I understand that the twos are going away, which will reduce a lot of the power of, for example, Tornado Shot, because you lose a lot of the arrows, but it won't reduce as much power from, for example, Lightning Arrow, which is still an incredibly strong skill. So I think they could be thinking about reverting this back to one-hander, or what I think would be the best idea, to make it somewhere in between one-handers and two-handers. Because it is kind of weird that a bow build that also gets a quiver, which is a massive damage upgrade, gets that slot and gets what two-handers have. Melee just doesn't get like a quiver slot. That is kind of awkward, and that used to be what bows are balanced around, right? That just makes sense. So I think that might have to go or might get adjusted a little bit down. Then let's talk about Mana Forged Arrows. I think Mana Forged Arrows has obviously mana uses, which I think is what they intended. Obviously, towards the very, very top end, you can do some absurd amounts of damage on Mana Stackers with Mana Forged Arrows, but it's also quite clunky. I think that's what they intended it to do. But the other changes, I mean, Mana Forged Arrows is just good in any bow build. And I don't know if that's what they intended to do. So maybe they're going to not make it work with Life Tap anymore and leave it at that, which is still going to make it viable. But I think they want to make it a little bit more niche and not auto-include anymore. One of the nice side effects of Mana Forged Arrows, though, inside the bow archetype is that you're less reliant on totems. A lot of endgame builds have actually opted to not go for totems at all anymore because they're just annoying, and you can now just have a second 6-link Mana Forged Arrow set up, which, even though I really like ballistas, I think that is a great change. But yeah, something we'll have to give. The last thing I want to address is how strong Tornado Shot is right now. So when Venging Cascade was around, which basically gave you a returning proj, no less multiplier, just straight up return, Lightning Arrow was actually competitive with Tornado Shot. Quite competitive in end game, even if you had like additional arrows and stuff like that, because your annoyance just doubled your damage. That is gone. You now need to use a support gem, and you get a 61% less damage multiplier on the return, which is like, you're basically halving your damage from what you had with Venging Cascade before. So that is a problem. But Lightning Arrow is still strong. Tornado Shot is just so far above everything else because it can shotgun. I don't know how to address this issue. I'm going to be completely honest. I love Tornado Shot in general. I don't want them to take away the shotgun capabilities. I would just like to buff stuff like, I don't know, Galvanic Arrow. How about you make this skill exist, for example? Or stuff like Split Arrow, right? And I know these have some niche applications, but I would just like to go maybe a little bit away from that meta. And maybe they will have to nerf Tornado Shot. Maybe they don't. In general, I think they will tackle bow builds somehow. So the second nerf here is a little bit more niche, but it is returning projectiles for poison. So when you look at poison and support gems, poison have some of the strongest support gems in their arsenal, and that's one of the reasons why they're so strong early, because support gems are free. You don't need any gear for them. So if you have strong support gems, you get a big power spike without having to invest. There's free support gems in particular, multi-strike, GMP, and returning projectiles. Obviously also greater volley, that have a less damage multiplier for hit builds, but they don't for poison builds. And that's because the less damage multiplier refers to projectiles, or as with multi-strike, attack, which doesn't include poison, which always kind of was weird to me. It made Molten Strike Poison and Lightning Strike Poison so much better than a lot of the other skills because they could basically use both, which was awkward. But now returning projectiles really hit the spot there. My current choice for League Starter would be a Poison Lightning Strike Pathfinder, which, if returning projectiles wasn't there, would be pretty weak early, but you get so much power from this. This is like straight up 100% more damage on Lightning Strike from a support gem, and it makes clear way more fun and way better. I can use all of these free support gems early. And even though I would love to play that build, I'm just asking why. Like, why? What is the deal with that? Why do poison builds get so much power from the support gems and hit builds just don't? Hit builds are already kind of in a struggle to get into crit in mid game, so I don't really know why that is. I think if I would nerf this, I would just make the less damage multiplier global, but I would potentially buff it in general. So for example, instead of 61% less damage while returning only projectiles, I would make it global, but maybe only make it 50%. So yeah, this one, I just don't know why it exists. When this gem first came out, I didn't even believe it. Everybody was just like, no, that's no way it works like that, even though it's worded like that. But yeah. The third one we have to talk about is Kaom Spirit. Currently, 13% of top builds are playing these gloves because it turns out Berserk for free is pretty good. It's not necessarily free because you have to get some regen, and you also have to give up regen, which could be annoying a little bit with Blood Rage. But you have workarounds with that. For example, Enduring Cry, or for example, the Guardian node right here, Time of Need. And with permanent, I obviously mean 70 to 80% uptime or something, and it's not actually that hard to get to. Like, I would say 7 rage is kind of the cutoff point where it starts to feel good. In general, I don't know what to do about Kaom Spirit because they really make your build feel good, which I don't really want to get nerfed, but at the same time, it kind of limits the options that you have. They could either increase the regen you need, which doesn't fix all of them, but it will make it a little bit more niche, especially for bow builds, which can just run it maybe a little bit too easily right now. Maybe only Guardians or specific interactions should be allowed to have this. Not really sure. You can nerf it from 100 to 150. Or the other, more direct one would be nerf Berserk. But I think that would nerf just melee builds on top of everything else, which I don't think is a good look. Now, Pathfinder is an interesting one. Having your flasks up always is very, very powerful. So how do you tackle nerfing Pathfinder? Pathfinder has been everywhere, and that's because of Nature's Reprisal, which I think might get nerfed, but I want to focus more on like the end game applications of Pathfinder and the flask node. So first I was thinking you could maybe rework Nature's Adrenaline to not be as strong and be like the backbone of this whole archetype, but then you would make it so it's very hard to actually get permanent flasks. And that's a big deal because that's one of the things that Pathfinder just do. You tick your flask and it's actually true. It's not just PoE, right? But maybe the problem is actually in the flask effect nodes, the small nodes, especially with some recent flasks like Progenesis, which might get nerfed. I don't know. But it kind of poses a problem where the design space of flasks is a little bit limited because of the whole Ascendancy, but especially because of the flask effect right here. So maybe make that flask effect with magic utility flasks or something. That could be an idea. I think if they buff Nature's Reprisal, they're going to keep the Wither, but reduce the Wither effect to like 30%. It would still be good, but wouldn't be as much of a crazy power upgrade anymore. Still very strong, though. The problem with Wither effect right now is they utterly nerfed Corruption, so unless you have really good uptime, you don't even want to anoint that anymore. Other than that, what I would like to see buff-wise is make Master Alchemist a little bit better, maybe make up for some of the flask effect being lost here. I don't know how you would rework this, but Master Distiller, I do know, because this node is utterly nonsensical. On skill use, it consumes 3 charges of a flask on the side of the tree where you're mostly getting fast hitting skills, like stuff that has 5 to 10 attacks per second. It just makes no sense. Even on a Pathfinder, there's no way to sustain that. Never. And even if you could, it wouldn't be worth the investment, right? For what? For 150% crit shot. Like, if this node just straight up gave you these free bonuses, it would still not really be that OP. It would be strong, but not OP. This node is just ridiculous. So this node, I would really like this node to be reworked. It would also help a lot because right now Pathfinder is a little bit cornered into builds that are either so strong they don't need any damage, they can use Pathfinder, or mostly poison builds. So you would have like a little bit of an alternative for hit-based builds. Now, Guardian leveling I put here, but I don't want this to get nerfed. Straight up, I do not want this to get nerfed. I recently leveled with Guardian Spark, and Spark really sucks early. Like, it's just really, really bad. It needs levels to scale. It needs projectile speed to scale. You need to get to the duration cluster to make it feel a little bit better. It didn't matter. This thing just destroys everything. It literally doesn't matter. So it was the most fun I've ever had while leveling because I really don't care. I don't want it to be hard. I want to get to endgame. I want to do cool stuff. So maybe that's the wrong approach, but I would like this to still have it in the game. But I predict after playing it, and I'm sure they are aware of this, they will cut this damage by maybe even half. I think the less damage taken is fine because you still have to resummon it, which can be a hassle, but you do get like basically a fortify. In endgame maps, it can die though if you have no support, so I think it's balanced still. But the damage that this dishes out at level 30, level 40, level 50, even into yellow maps is ridiculous. That being said, in terms of buffs, to balance this out a little bit, I really want them to see buff Radiant Faith. I think Unwavering Faith is almost there. It's not quite there, but you could make it work in certain builds. It needs maybe another line of some kind of power, just raw power. But Radiant Faith is just like, this used to be, I think, 10%, and then they made it 25 in the patch notes. I don't really know if they thought about this node, but right now it's just not very good. And I guess I want to mention Time of Need here, because if Kaom Spirit gets nerfed, this node is basically useless. It is very, very weak for an Ascendancy. It's kind of just there to cheese with Kaom Spirit and get Perma Berserk, right? So if they address Kaom Spirit, I really want them to rework this as well. Now, number 6 is the Elemental Mastery. I'm a little bit torn on this one, but as everybody knows, this Mastery is completely busted. If we do the math and we pretend like the 25% chance to invert is double as good as the Ignore, then you could say it's like 50% Ignore, and you could almost argue it's like half Inevitable Judgment node, but it's even more interesting because you can still scale it with Pen on top. So I don't really know. If they want Inevitable Judgment to be good again, that would be a big deal. I'm not really sure if this would... I mean, this would utterly nerf a lot of builds, like basically every elemental damage build, so I'm not really sure what to do here. After that, we have Heatshiver, which the only problem I see with that is that some builds are only viable right now because of Heatshiver's existence, and if they don't buff those skills, that's going to be a big problem. I will say that I won't miss all the Heatshiver builds that actually can't freeze most bosses that have freeze ticked on PoE. It would also help out a lot of people by... yeah, not including fake DPS anymore. But Heatshiver, even with just a chill component, is just way too strong. And everybody kind of knows it, right? It's just, like, what are you going to do? Are you going to nerf it and then a lot of these skills are just not viable? I don't really trust them to make a pinpointed buff to skills that need Heatshiver and then nerf Heatshiver. So I would say probably not, but this has to be addressed at some point. And then at the end here, I have Instant Leech, which used to be that Valpact gave you Instant Leech. In case you guys don't know, didn't double it, it just gave you straight up Instant Leech, which was way more OP than the Instant Leech we have currently. But still, the current Instant Leech is incredible. It took them a while to nerf Valpact because the problem back then was there weren't enough sources of recovery to really take anything after Valpact was nerfed. So we had a long period where that was a little bit awkward. And out of the blue, I feel like the problem was kind of addressed, and out of the blue, they gave us Instant Leech again. Now, I want to make this clear. The way this Instant Leech works is 10% of Leech is instant. A single Leech instance cannot be higher than 10% of your HP. So 10% of 10% is basically 1%. So 1% of your total HP, you basically have a 1% life gain on hit. Unless you're a Slayer and you have Brutal Fervor, which is... maximum recovery per life leech. That is different to all the other nodes on the tree, at least last time I saw, because it's not duration based, it's per instance, right? So this actually gets you to 2% life regen on hit. On a 5k life build, that is 50 life gain on hit. And life gain on hit used to be something very much claw dependent, right? That was kind of like a payoff of claws. And a lot of other builds, for example, bow builds with tornado shot, should not have that much power. Hell, they even have these nodes on the tree that get completely invalidated. All of these get completely invalidated by instant leech. But the problems don't stop there. It's not just life leech, it's also mana and energy shield. And the mana is kind of comfy, but for most attack builds, which are the ones who have mana leech, it's not that important. But the energy shield leech part is kind of crazy, especially for EB builds. And if you think it's not that crazy, it's one mastery that basically can give you up to double-ish of what a Watcher's Eye with both vitality life gain on hit and discipline energy shield per hit would give you. This used to be a really sought-after Watcher's Eye for hybrid builds. How some hybrid builds would even use Discipline, which they would never normally do, just to get this mod. But yeah, I guess those are my opinions on the state of the game right now. I have a lot of other ones I would have liked to talk about, but the video is already way too long. I don't think half of these are going to happen. Maybe not even a fourth or anything, but yeah, a lot of things I wanted to discuss and throw out there. Maybe it's going to happen eventually. I don't know. Give me your opinions down in the comments. I'm sure I missed a lot of things. But with that being said, because I still don't have a slogan, see you next time.